So this is the Web Components Meetup Online. My name is Eva Howe, and I work for a company called This.Labs, who is our sponsor. We are a tech consultancy. We do everything Java, script and front end. So give us a call if you need some help. Our announcements for this are, whoops, little technical difficulties here today, bear with me. So we have a couple of events coming up. Our next one is Modern Web Online. It's going to be September 3rd at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then we'll have Angular Online on September 5th and React Online on September 12th. We're doing different meetups around the different frameworks. So we'd love to have you join us for that. And our speaker today is Justin. He is going to talk about the Polymer project at Google. And here's our little schedule. I'm giving you a little welcome, and then Justin will speak, and then we will have some closing notes and goodbye. And this is the Web Components Meetup Online. So let me stop sharing my screen, and Justin, you can take it away.
Hey everyone online, I saw some familiar faces in the chat room there. Good to see you all, and people who don't know me. I am Justin Fagnani. I work at Google on the Polymer team. The Polymer team works on a number of things, including web component specs, web components polyfills, the classic Polymer library, and now our new libraries like lit HTML and element. And I usually do a lot of talks about like templating and lit HTML, but for this meetup, I wanted to try something a little different and talk generally about styling and theming, which I think is something that concerns everybody who's writing web components. Especially people writing complex apps, and it's a changing area with lots of new stuff, so I thought this would be interesting to talk about it. And it's a pretty vast area, so I'll try to fit this in the allotted time, but part of the vastness comes from a lot of different ways that we need to think about and talk about styling and theming. So there's these different axes here that I think about here. Things like the difference between defining a component and the styles that the component makes for itself versus using a component and styling it when you use it and customizing it. The difference between styling and theming, because those are definitely different concerns. And the difference between features you can get from the platform, like native theming features, and what you might be able to do over the top with user-land solutions. So to go into this a little bit, I think one of the most important things is talking about this defining versus using distinction. And this applies, I think, conceptually, whether or not the framework or the UI toolkit you're using has these concepts. But when you're dealing with styling a component, you usually have the internals of the component, which I styled blue here, and I'll be using this my-element example component throughout the presentation. So when you're building the component, you want to write styles for that component to style itself. And a component exists inside of an environment. In our case, this is going to be a style scope inside of HTML, but that environment is going to want to use and customize the styling for the component. So it's very important to think about these two different areas here, the defining and the using. And next, we have the difference between styling and theming. So I'm going to define this as saying that styling is when you directly use a component and you want to customize that component at the use site, right when you use it. So if you have some markup with a component, you say, that tag right there, I want to change its color. Theming, we're going to say, is like styling, but it's deep. It cuts across entire swaths of your UI. And you want to say, I want to change the styles of all components or all instances of this particular component. And then platform versus user land. So on the left over here, I have some CSS that's using a new platform feature called CSS Shadow Parts. And so we see we have a new selector that the browser natively supports. And this will let us do some customization of a component. But we also have techniques available to us via kind of cooperation over scripting. And so these are user land solutions, and I'm going to show you how you can use some of those to implement theming in components. Okay, so with those distinctions, next I want to really briefly cover the thing that really either ties the room together or kind of trips us up in some cases, is shadow DOM. That's really the important concept for all of this, which I think most people who come to this meetup are probably well aware of. So the most important thing I think to know with styling and Shadow DOM is that Shadow DOM gives you scopes and bounds. And what we mean by this is that if you look from the perspective of any component, that it has a shadow root, and in that shadow root it defines a scope, which contains the elements that are directly in that shadow root, but doesn't contain the elements in other shadow roots. So if we have some tree of components here, and this isn't like an HTML tree, this is the tree of the shadow roots that I'm trying to draw. At the top level, we might have one scope. And then if we go down a level here, we'll see a different scope. And these are separate scopes where styles can apply separately. And the way this works is that Shadow DOM gives you, first, for this example here, for this chart, let's say we want to do something like we want to style the my-child components that my-element is using on the right-hand side over here. So typically with CSS, you have global CSS, and if you write a selector like my-child and style it pink, it's going to style everything on the page. So what Shadow DOM gives you is bounds. First, it gives you an upper bound, and that prevents styling that a component uses from leaking upwards to its parents or into its cousins. So now we're going to eliminate some of the my-child styling that we didn't want there. And then next it gives you a lower bound. And that's going to prevent styles from leaking into shadow roots of your children, shadow roots of shadow roots. So it's going to mean that you can only style the elements directly in your control. And so this often gives us what we want. Our styles don't leak across the page. We can write simpler selectors, less classes all over our DOM, and things become more manageable. And we don't accidentally let things become stylable that we didn't want to be stylable. So yay, encapsulation is great. It makes things a lot more manageable. This is especially important if you're working on a large project and trying to maintain this project over many years and be able to migrate it and change an implementation detail without someone else having relied on the internals of the component. So we really like encapsulation. But it does get in our way sometimes. So next somebody will come to you and say, oh, I like your components, but I want to use Bootstrap. And Bootstrap or all these other CSS frameworks, they work by styling everything in the page. And they expect access to every node in the page. And if you have things in shadow roots, this isn't going to work so well. So here's an example. You want Bootstrap to be able to make all your children, all your my-child elements, different colors all over the page. So if you're used to this global scope way of working and you're trying to use libraries that are assuming that, encapsulation is going to be a barrier to. And so what we try to do when we think about theming with Shadow DOM encapsulation is that encapsulation puts this hard boundary, this yellow circle here, on your component. And it says styles will not pass through. And we have some internal structure, and this encapsulation protects that internal structure from being accidentally styled. But if we want to allow it to be styled, we want to expose this outside of the shadow group. And so what we're going to do in a number of different techniques that I get into next is we're going to talk about basically how we style, how we expose internal structure as a public interface. And this is going to bring in the theme of cooperation, where styling and theming is really about cooperating between an element and its environment over a number of different bridges that are going to help us get past this encapsulation boundary. Okay, so encapsulation is now something that is neither great in all cases nor bad in all cases. It's something we just have to investigate a little further and control. Okay, so before I get into the details here, I want to give a quick overview of different ways that we can escape style encapsulation. And some of these might have some non-traditional definitions. So host styling. An element, somebody has their microphone on. I'm hearing some keyboard noise. So an element can style itself. And I'll get into that later, but an element can also be styled at its use site. And so the element itself sits at this encapsulation boundary. It rides the edge of it. And so in one way, the element being able to style itself or styled from the outside is a way to break encapsulation a little bit. This similarly applies to styling children. So when you style children of an element, the element is kind of reaching outside in a limited sense and styling nodes outside of its shadow DOM. So that's one way breaking encapsulation too. Next, we have property inheritance. Inherited CSS properties like color and font family and all custom variables, they pure shadow roots, so they let us break encapsulation. And then CSS shadow parts lets you define custom pseudo elements. We'll get into that, and so that way you can expose specific parts of your DOM to the outside world. And then finally, we'll look at two proposals, custom pseudo classes that let you define your own pseudo classes you can select on, and : theme, which lets you do shadow parts but deeply across a tree. So all of these techniques here are going to let us break free of that encapsulation a little bit to do styling. Okay, as we get into styles, the first thing I wanted to talk about was how you load styles. Because no matter what you can do with them, you have to get them into your page and into your component. Most of you probably be familiar with these techniques, so I'll try to go kind of fast here. The first way that you can associate styles with a component is to put a style tag in your shadow root. So inline style tags in a shadow root apply only to that shadow root. And the way you might do it with a very vanilla element here, I'm not using any of our libraries, it's just an element that extends HTML element directly, is that we'll create a shadow root, and inside of it, we will simply put a style tag that has some styles, and those will apply only to the content of the shadow root. And one nice thing is that most browsers deduplicate identical style tags. So even if you do this inside of many instances of a component, the browser will share one style sheet across all of them. Okay, another thing that you can do is you can put a link tag inside of a shadow root. This works roughly as you expect. It'll load the CSS and then style the content. One problem with this technique, which is why I don't recommend it, is that because you have to programmatically create shadow roots, we're not blocking the parser in any way here. So this way is asynchronous, and you might get a flash of unstyled content as the browser loads the style sheet. Another problem here is that the href attribute is relative to the page, not relative to the component. So you might have some issues with being able to reference your style sheet correctly out of the link tag. So this works, but I generally don't recommend it. And then next up, we have something which is really awesome that I love. It's called constructible style sheets. So constructible style sheets just let you new up a CSS style sheet and then set the style text on it. So up here, we're in our module for our component, we're going to create a style sheet and give it some CSS text. And then later on, what you can do is you can attach that style sheet to multiple shadow roots throughout your page. And that's just going to be a reference to those styles. And the really nice thing here is that if you have a bunch of elements that share some styles, they all just get a simple JavaScript reference to one shared style sheet. So this is very good for performance. And it also makes styles quite easy to share across different types of components. You might have your base theme that you add to all of your shadow roots. And then real quick, this is kind of the only place I'm going to mention like the Polymer project libraries here. But I wanted to point out that you can kind of add sugar in the JavaScript space to make some of this easier to use, so we don't have to be so imperative like newing up a constructible style sheet. So we do this in lit element. We let you define your styles inline to your component in static, so these are all shared across all instances of this component. This uses constructible style sheets if they're available. So if you're running in Chrome, Opera, or the new Edge, this will use constructible style sheets. And if constructible style sheets aren't available, it will fall back to automatically putting style tags in your shadow root. And one nice thing about this is that it lets you really easily share styles between components. So here I have an example where you import some base styles that were defined with that CSS tag from a common module. And then you can combine them with the styles for a particular element. So styles can also be an array. And so you can put them in order and share style sheets and override them with your own local styles later. So this is really, really nice for ergonomics. And we don't want to limit this just to the element. So this is something that we hope other web component libraries do, and maybe we can start collaborating on making these APIs compatible. And one way to do that this is my first feature I'm going to talk about that doesn't exist yet. This is a proposal. One way to do that is with CSS modules. So CSS modules, here, I'm going to back up to that lit element, the constructible style sheet example. So we saw here that you could in code construct a style sheet and then add it to your shadow root. What we're going to do instead with CSS modules is we're just going to import styles from an external CSS file. So they no longer have to be embedded in JavaScript. And this, as a standard means that any web component library has a standard common way of importing styles. And this is what people love to do already with tooling and userland projects out there, even called in the userland project CSS modules. And this is really what people want to do to get their styles into JavaScript. So this lets you import CSS directly into JavaScript. The module exports a CSS style sheet object, which then you can use with adopted style sheets. One nice thing about this is, like JavaScript modules, the CSS can be loaded and parsed off the main thread, so you reduce main thread work and jank. And this is currently being implemented right now by Microsoft in Chromium. So we're very excited to see this become available. And this is also much better for tooling. So if you have a tooling pipeline that produces CSS from Sass or runs some kind of processors like ProCSS, those can just generate CSS files and then pull them into your JavaScript. Okay, so that's a couple different ways to get styles there to your components. Now let's look at how shadow roots actually interact with the world. First, we're going to take a look at selectors inside shadow roots. This might be very common practice to everybody who's already using web components. So some of this will be a little review. The first thing is just plain selectors. Right? If you have some selectors inside of your shadow root, so here we're going to color a div red, that's going to apply to elements inside of the shadow root and only elements inside of the shadow root. All right, so we know this, and this is what we like about shadow dom. Okay, next is host styles. So I said that I kind of consider this one way of breaking encapsulation, but host styles let an element style itself. So here we're going to give this element a background of honeydew. And the thing to note is that the element is also stylable from the outside, like I mentioned. So these are just the default styles, and they're overridable by elements on the outside. Next is a variation of the host selector that can be used for conditional styling and theming to give some control to your users. In this host selector works like a function, and it takes a sub-selector inside the parentheses. And so this can be an attribute selector. Oh, I probably wrote this wrong here. That should have been had some braces around it. It can be a class selector, an attribute selector. It can be a tag name selector, anything that can match the element directly. And then you can put some different styles when the host matches that. So as an example, here we have the element with the default styles, and here we have an element where we've added an attribute, and that's going to change the background color to a different color. Okay, next we have slotted, and this should say : slotted. Yeah, so slotted lets you style your direct children. So this is another way that styles can kind of reach out of a shadow root into its outside scope. And so the way that it works is that you do : slotted, and you, oh, I might have messed up this example up here. You give it a slot name, and then you're able to slot direct children of your element here. So here we're going to style this paragraph element here, and that's going to become red. But one thing about slotted styles is they only style top-level children, not ancestors. So this paragraph tag here is not going to be red. And this is due to being able to efficiently implement this feature. The way style resolution works is that from any element, the browser is going to walk up the tree to see what styles match. And we really don't want to have to like walk up the tree and then walk back down shadow roots to see if there's any slotted styles anywhere in the page that might slot this thing. That would make styles too slow. So you can only style direct children. Okay, next let's look at styling from outside of the shadow root. So this is when you're using a component. First, we have plain selectors. Just like host selectors inside of the shadow root, these style the component itself only. And these ones override the default styling. And the thing remember here is that custom elements are just regular elements. So of course you can select them and style them like other elements. But because of shadow root, you cannot style the element internals. But you can affect some of the stylings inside the shadow root. So the first thing is that inheriting properties like color and font family do inherit through the shadow root boundary. And so, this is very critical for being able to get minimal consistency on a page. You probably want to have the same font and the same font color, go through your shadow boundaries. And of course, you can override this and say that you don't want to inherit, that you need the color to be something specific inside your shadow root. Okay, and because inheriting properties go through shadow roots, this lets us use custom properties for styling and building. So custom properties, they all inherit. And the way they work is that at the use site, so I'm going to use this green box to represent the styles inside of the shadow root. At the use site, you use a var declaration with a custom variable name. And that says, if that value is set, go ahead and use it here for this property. If not, fall back to this other value. And then outside of the element, you're able to set the value of the custom property, and that will flow through. And now the divs inside of this shadow root will be styled with a secondary color of aquamarine. And so these let us start defining our public styling interface. One thing is you should choose the names wisely here. You should either have generic names that apply across all of your components and are common to a theme, or you should probably prefix your names with the custom element names so that they don't collide with other custom properties in your tree somewhere. Okay, and another way of styling things inside of a shadow root that's brand new. This is landed in Chrome a couple versions ago, so it's available Chrome Opera and brand new Edge, and I think it's being implemented in Firefox behind a flag right now. So this is CSS shadow parts. What these are is really custom pseudo classes. So on an input, you might have : placeholder, which lets you style this pseudo, I'm sorry, these are not pseudo classes, these are pseudo elements. You might have : placeholder, which lets you style the placeholder text inside of an input. Well, you want to be able to create the same kind of pseudo element for your web components. So in this case, what you do is you define a part with a part attribute in the HTML that's in your shadow root. So in this case, we're going to say that this div has a part name of thumb, like used for scrubbing audio and video. And parts can have multiple names, so they work somewhat like classes. And you style them from outside of the shadow root with the : part selector. So this selector here is going to say for every my element, we're not going to select the my element, we're going to select the part that it exposed called thumb. And here we're going to style that with a background of red. So this is brand new, but it's very kind of necessary and needed kind of progress for letting us be able to style elements in a controlled way by breaking encapsulation just for specific elements. There's another part of this here too, where shadow parts, they only let you style things from the direct scope that contains the element. So they only go one level deep. They do not go down through the whole tree. So if you try to style that thumb, it's not going to style like nested video players that are inside of other elements. So if you want to make parts that you're using available as stylable parts to your users, you have to export them and forward them. And so you do that by using the export parts attribute here. And what you say is what part you want exported. And you can rename this if you need to, but by default it keeps the same name. And now you'll see if we have some other wrapper element that's going to wrap our my element, that you can style the part just like you could before. And via forwarding, you can forward parts as far as you need to up the tree. All right, so you can imagine how you can implement some kind of theming this way, but you have to manually kind of export all the parts of your components, of all your subcomponents. So that could get a little cumbersome. Okay, and another way proposal that we have kind of in flight is custom pseudo classes. So shadow parts let you do custom pseudo elements. Custom pseudo classes let you define your own pseudo classes. This is a proposal that is, hopefully we're going to see a new version of this coming up soon, and we'll see progress on it. So it lets you select a component based on its internal state. So right now you could do this, say, by setting an attribute on yourself and telling your users to use an attribute selector. But we really don't want our components modifying their own DOM and creating attributes. So what this lets us do is style, based on some internal state that's completely hidden, expose that the state as a pseudo class. And the way this works, it uses this new element internals API, so that an element can get an internal object that represents kind of private API that is not available to consumers. So first we call attach internals, and we stash that object as like this internals object here. And the shape of this API for pseudo classes is a little bit up in the air. It's not solidified yet, but it's going to look something like a class list, I think. So you'll be able to toggle, say, this foo state. And this will define our custom pseudo class there. And once you do that, from the outside, you'll be able to have a pseudo class selector that's going to be generic, like state, and take a parameter, which is the name that custom state was defined by the component, and you'll be able to style the component based on that. So think about this as some flag that you can flip on and off for your component based on its state. So hopefully we'll see a more concrete proposal for this very soon. And one nice thing about this is they could work really nicely with custom pseudo elements. So you might expose a part that has a different kind of state. So here we might have the thumb part for our video element, and we might have different states based on whether it's playing or not. So you might want to color it red if it's playing it and gray if it's not. Combining these can be very useful there. Okay, so that's styling. That's basically how do we take an element we directly use and customize it. Theming is an important variation of styling where you want to theme things across shadow boundaries. So theming is basically equivalent to deep styling. You want to cross many shadow boundaries, and ideally themes should be tree-based because you might have some kind of changes that you want to make just for a certain panel in the page, not for the entire page. So there's a couple ways we can do theming currently. One of them is with custom properties. I mentioned that they inherit across shadow boundaries. So really the only mechanism we have for doing deep cross shadow root styling today. But they work particularly nice for design systems. So here's some code out of like a material design theme that I found out there. So the material design component set that this is based on have defined a whole bunch of custom property names. And then anywhere in your DOM tree, you can define these names to set up your material theme. And you can have a material theme for different parts of your page by defining these properties on different elements. So this is really nice for that kind of stuff, for things that you use variables for, font, faces, colors. It ends up being a little bit cumbersome if you're trying to style specific elements, because then you have to create a custom property for each property that you want to make stylable on that element, and this can lead to an explosion of properties. So that brings us to a proposal that is on the table, which is a deep version of : part. And we call this : theme, maybe should be called shadow themes. This used to be part of the shadow parts spec, but it was removed so we could get progress on : part. And the way it's likely going to work is that we have an attribute that's much like part, but it's called theme. And what this means is let this element be stylable, but from anywhere above it in the shadow root tree. And on the outside, you use it very much like : part, and you provide a theme part name. And again, this means style the theme part with this name anywhere down the tree from where you define these styles across any number of shadow roots. So hopefully we see a new proposal for this coming up soon, which will be very great for especially component libraries with web components. All right, and finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about user land theming. So Shadow DOM can, it's great for encapsulation and for great software engineering practices. But there's a number of ways it gets in the way if you're trying to theme across your whole page. We have these proposals coming along that are supposed to solve a lot of these problems, but they're not here yet. So what can you do in the meantime? Well, one thing to realize is that we have the power of JavaScript available to us. And elements and code outside of the elements can cooperate to provide styles to the elements. And we've seen this in libraries out there. Vaadin has a themable mixin that they've created for their elements that lets you do this. And the idea, regardless of the implementation, is roughly the same. The idea is that a theme will provide styles to some kind of custom API. So up here I have just a made up example API where you can add some kind of theme with a name and some CSS styles that apply to it. So probably a good idea is to make your styles anticipate and match the shadow part API. So maybe you want to limit yourself to selecting on part attributes, and then later on you could switch this to using actual CSS shadow part selectors. But the idea is, in this example, is that these styles are going to be stored in a map keyed off of the style name myElement. And then what an element that's cooperating in the system would do is this would go get the themes for myElement. And in this case, the theme name is just a string. So this could correspond to a particular element that you want to style, or could correspond to some more cross-cutting concern like all important elements or all input type elements. And then using adopted style sheets, you can imagine that it would be fairly easy to now apply the styles that you get out of the theme system to the individual components. So this is not a real API I'm showing right here. This is just an example of what you could do if you wanted to create a cooperative theming system in JavaScript. Okay, and so this example here, by the way, is not tree-based. This is global. So there's like one global map, and all the components in the page will get styles from that global map. But themes are great when they're tree-based because you can kind of customize different parts of your page. And that's also possible, especially with events. I love using events to do tree-scoped things like context and dependency injection and now theming. So the way you might do this is that first you would want to fire an event that represents like, give me the theme that I need. This event might have additional information like the theme name, but the important parts are that it has to bubble up and it has to compose out of shadow roots. And we're going to start with an empty detail here. And something that wants to provide a theme is going to listen to this event and put the theme inside the detail. So what we can do is dispatch this event, and then because events are synchronous, immediately after we dispatch the event, we can go ahead and look and get some theme styles out of the event detail, and then just attach them to our shadow root with adopted style sheets. Again, this isn't a real library. This is just some example code. But this shows how you can get themes and look them up based on the tree location of your component. So this might be useful for people in enterprise who can make components that can cooperate this way. Okay, so that's basically all the kind of techniques that I wanted to show you. But it's useful if we take a little bit of a step back and think about what this gets us if we put it all together sometime in the near future. I think all of these things, especially the new features and the proposals, are quite exciting. So they're going to give us encapsulation that we already have with Shadow DOM that really helps us control our components and make sure that we can manage components in complex pages. But we're also going to get stylability and themability and an easy way to load this. So I feel like we're kind of quickly heading towards like the holy grail of component styling and theming here. So it's super exciting to me. So for loading, again, we're going to have CSS modules available. And I put web packaging here as a kind of collaborator in this space. So web packaging is like a standard way of bundling assets. And we're going to need a way to bundle individual CSS modules together to deliver them efficiently. So these two are going to work quite well together. When you want to apply styles to a particular component, you're going to use adopted style sheets. This lets you do things efficiently by reference. Again, if you want to style a specific part of a component, we're going to use : part, CSS shadow parts. If you want to style based on state, we're going to use the custom pseudo classes : state selector. And then for theming, we have custom properties now, and hopefully we will get : theme soon to style across entire subtrees. So this is it all together. I hope I've kind of painted a picture of where things are and where they're going, and you have an idea of the problems and techniques we have in front of us. Yeah, so that's styling and theming with web components. I don't know what's next if we have time for Q&A, but I'll gladly take questions.
Yes, we definitely have time for Q&A. I know there was some lively chat on the chat. I'm not sure what the state of that is. If there were still questions, people were going back and forth and answering. I guess I'll just put it out to the audience. Is there anybody that still had a question that needed answering? Please feel free to unmute and ask.
Carlos says maybe expand what was in our web components.
That was part of the chat discussion.
Okay.
It wasn't a question for you directly.
Okay.
But one of the things that I've seen in the shadow parts explainer and in the, sorry, not the explainer, in the spec and in Monica's explainer of shadow parts and themes is that the syntax for, particularly for shadow parts, can get really complex really quickly. Is that going to be the default way of addressing parts and later themes? Or are there ways that this may be eased in for people who may not be familiar, may not be comfortable with the syntax?
I'm not really aware of any like other additional syntax proposals. I mean, it's a new feature, so it's going to require people get familiar with the feature. I don't know if there's like an existing CSS analog that you could just kind of like hack the syntax into, right?
Okay.
Like we don't, CSS hasn't before had a way of creating pseudo elements. So we need a way to do that. So I don't know, I personally don't view the syntax as particularly complex. Like there's an attribute called part that works a lot like class, and people understand class. So this is just like a different name for that. And then, yeah, the selector looks like a pseudo element, but it takes a name to it. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the only ways you can kind of do that, because you don't want to kind of like put native pseudo elements and custom pseudo elements in the same namespace, because you might have userland code prevent the platform from adding new pseudo elements. So you need to separate them somewhere, which : part does. I hope people will, get used to it, or if it is a problem, maybe some userland library can come up with an idea on top.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Justin, there was a good question just a second up from the bottom from Dave Batiste about, you might want to address that.
So the question there is, what approach do you recommend for a component to change styles based on the state of some arbitrary ancestor? For instance, to change some position styles based on LTR, RTL. Yeah, I don't know that we have the answer here yet. Dave Batiste mentioned a selector called : host context, which lets you do this. That is under some dispute, and so I don't know if we can rely on that. Yeah, at some of the web component standards meetings, there has been talk about, the need to essentially be able to observe some kind of state from arbitrarily above the tree, like whether that state is like attribute state, because dir can be affected by, I think, both an attribute. I'm not actually an expert there, both an attribute and CSS styling. I think this is just something that needs more spec work. And yeah, in terms of like what you could do in userland for that, I don't know if some kind of mutation observer or something there would help. But yeah, you basically want to observe the DOM and observe CSS. I personally would love a facility for having a style observer where you could just say like, tell me when the style of this property on this element changes. And then that would work for any inherited property that flows down the tree. So you could say like, tell me when dir changes. I think you can kind of do this with Houdini because a paint worklet will need to rerun when CSS changes. But it might be a bit of a hack getting data into a paint worklet and then back out of it. So I'm not sure that's the intended use case, but that would be useful. Okay, from Owen, we have, are the new CSS selectors going to be the way to theme instead of attach shadow mode option? The attach shadow mode option, which is the mode option to attach shadow root, whether it's open or closed, that doesn't actually really affect the topic here. Because an open shadow root really still is closed in a lot of ways for styling, right? Like you can't just like style things in an open shadow root.
Yeah, I guess that was the question. Has anybody asked to have it support both, or is the decision, or is kind of the path going to be more along the selectors will do that for you? Don't anticipate an open shadow to ever support CSS, I guess.
What do you mean for an open shadow to support CSS?
Well, maybe it's just my misunderstanding, but in terms of like, say, trying to unit test components and things like that, I noticed that being able to select into a shadow DOM would only work for JavaScript, but not CSS. So I'd always have to open the shadow to enable unit testing. And my research led me to conclude that it would not work for CSS.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the whole point of shadow root is to prevent selectors from going in there. So I don't think there's going to be a way to open that up. You know, if you're testing, you know, your layout and rendering and your shadow DOM is part of the output of the element. And I don't think there's a problem with, you know, having test code like go into the shadow root and, you know, verify that it's in particular states. It's very similar to screenshot testing. So I think that's totally valid for tests to do. Even if you have a closed shadow root, you can do that by patching attached shadow in your tests. So I think the selector and part approach is going to be what goes forward.
I should just say, all those new selectors do look awesome. I just was curious about the other option. Thank you.
Yeah. Material Web Components 1.0. I do not have any insights. I do know a lot more work is happening on that right now. And so presumably the timeline is accelerating, but that's all I really know there. Oh, in the state of polyfills, thank you, Dave Lockhart, because I should have mentioned this more. We do not yet really have polyfills for shadow parts or CSS modules. I think there is a community member who has a shadow part polyfill, which I have not investigated yet. But we are working on that. We have a branch in lit element, which is trying to use our kind of fallback, kind of custom cooperation approach so that we create an API so you can tell an element, hey, add these shadow part themes or styles to it. It's not performing where we want right now. It's like just a little too slow on Safari. So we're still working on that there. For constructible style sheets, we have a few people who've made a start on a polyfill there, and I think that's going to be like relatively tractable. And that's going to be great because it's going to allow sharing styles between components from different frameworks like Stencil and Lit Element. So I hope we get that going pretty soon. Yeah, that looks like the questions there. Anyone else?
Sounds like that's it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for showing up.
Goodbye.
All right. Thank you.